Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, Episode 3. I am the show's host, Kyle, and we have lots of foreign policy news to talk about today as the Trump administration really starts to implement Trump's foreign policy. Many of his cabinet members and advisors have taken their roles, and we're really starting to see his overall philosophy on foreign policy take shape, although it's not quite as different as the Obama foreign policy as many would have thought. But first, I would just like to remind my listeners that if you have any questions or comments about the show, please get in contact with me by emailing me at kylesfilesblog@gmail.com, at facebook.com/kylefiles, or by leaving a comment on kylesfilesblog.com. In all those cases, files is spelled F-Y-L-E-S. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the show. We're going to start today's show on some internal U.S. politics. Mike Mulvaney was confirmed as the director of the Office of Management and Budget. This office is really in charge of the kind of designing the president's budget and getting that all in order. One thing that's good about Mr. Mulvaney is that he is not afraid of cutting defense spending, and as a Republican, that's something he might actually be able to get done. In fact, he is so in favor of cutting defense funding that John McCain actually refused to vote for his confirmation. So anytime John McCain will give you a black mark, that's a good check mark in my book. So hopefully we'll see some cuts to defense, because the U.S. spends as much on defense as the next 10 countries in the world combined. Just pour money into our defense department, and we really don't need any more money there. It'll be interesting to see how this aligns with Trump's philosophy, as Trump has said that our military has become weakened under Obama and that we need to rebuild the military. It seems like if you were interested in rebuilding the military, you would be spending more on it. With Mulvaney as his budget director, we may see some cuts in defense spending. Maybe Mulvaney will really look into cutting the waste, fraud, and abuse and really rolling back some of the more wasteful and unnecessary programs at the Pentagon. Trump met with Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday, and they had a meeting and then a press conference afterwards. A couple interesting things came out of the press conference. First, Trump said that the U.S. wasn't necessarily dedicated to the two-state solution. This has been the long-standing policy of the U.S. and most of the rest of the world, that there would be a two-state solution in Israel at some point in time. The two-state solution would mean that there would be an Israeli state and a separate Palestinian state. However, this has been waiting to happen for 50 years or more now, and no real steps have been taken to establish a Palestinian state, and the Palestinians rather just live under the military occupation of the Israeli armed forces. The importance of this statement is maybe showing a little bit of reality on Trump's view of the situation in Israel, that the Israelis at this point have taken so much Palestinian land that it may simply be impossible to form a Palestinian state at this point. If we look at it, there would be a couple problems. One is Gaza is not connected to the West Bank, so if you have a Palestinian state, you would essentially have part of Palestine on the Mediterranean Sea and the other part of Palestine on the Jordan River, and how possibly freely travel back and forth between those two areas of the Palestinian state would seem to be impossible. The other issue with the two-state solution, like I said, is that there may not be enough room in Palestine for all the Palestinians. There's 6 million Palestinian refugees living in other countries outside of Palestine. So with how tight the area is in Palestine for the Palestinians that live there, it seems that it would be impossible to actually have a true Palestinian state with enough room for everyone. The good news about the one-state solution is that it could really expose the situation in Israel for what it is, where you have a group of Israelis essentially occupying and having a group of Arab Palestinians living as second-class citizens. One state we're hoping to get the one man, one vote situation where every citizen of the Israeli state, Jewish or Muslim, would be able to vote in the election and would have a say. It could also expose the state for what it is, which is essentially an apartheid state at this point, where if you are a Palestinian, you may have to walk through 4 or 5 checkpoints just to get to school in the morning. You could have your base searched by Israeli troops anytime you go through one of these checkpoints, and it's really a very oppressive situation. And so I don't know if Trump actually understood what he said, or that, maybe he doesn't understand that this is what would happen, that the Israeli state would be exposed as oppressing the Palestinians. It's even possible that Trump would be completely in favor of an apartheid state in Israel, and that he wouldn't care if the Israelis and Benjamin Netanyahu oppressed the Palestinians. But I think the rest of the world would finally stand up and take notice, and the situation where we have a group of people basically living under military occupation from the neighboring country would no longer exist, and people would have to take notice. While that happened, Nikki Haley came out the next day and said that at the UN that the United States is still committed to a two-state solution. So I'm not sure if Trump and Nikki Haley are on the same page, if Nikki Haley's statement was a way for the Trump administration to walk back Trump's statements, or if Nikki Haley and Donald Trump don't understand what it means to have a one or two state solution, or just out there running their mouths talking about absolutely nothing. I suppose all of those options are possible, but like I said, I'm hoping that maybe if we give up the fantasy of a two-state solution, then we could start moving towards a real solution for Israel and Palestine, because the status quo is just a military occupation of Palestine, with sometime in the future the Palestinians getting their own state, but it doesn't seem like that's ever going to happen. The other interesting news that came out during the press conference with Trump and Netanyahu is that Trump said that the settlement expansions in Israel are a barrier to peace. And this seems to be realism on Trump, that Israelis taking more Palestinian land is causing hatred directed at the Israelis from the Palestinians. It is a barrier to peace. And this is a good thing, because if the settlements keep expanding, eventually there's going to be no room left for the Palestinians and the Palestinian state. I'm now going to move into talking about some news between the U.S. and Russia. First, U.S. and Russian military officials, as well as some State Department officials, met on Thursday. Top U.S. military officials met with top Russian military officials, and Rex Tillerson, the U.S. Secretary of State, met with his counterpart from Russia. One of the things that came out of the meeting between the military officials was that the U.S. would not be working with Russia to combat ISIS in Syria. It's my preference that the U.S. just get out of Iraq and Syria and not bother with fighting ISIS there, because the more we fight ISIS there, the more anti-Americanism we create, and ISIS and jihadism becomes a bigger risk for America, not a smaller risk, by combating ISIS. But so long as we are going to be operating in that theater, I think it would be better for the U.S. to have some relations with Russia in that situation, and maybe even the two countries work together. One advantage of this would be the U.S. and Russia would start to build some good diplomatic relations. Combining ISIS together would show that the two countries would be able to operate in the same theater, get along, and accomplish a mission. We've seen this happen between Turkey and Russia. Even after Turkey shot down a Russian jet and it looked like Turkey and Russia may be headed for war, they are now able to use each other to progress in the mission against ISIS, and it's really shown a positive because they've been able to negotiate ceasefires in Syria and even work towards some peace talks. The other advantage to the U.S. and Russia collaborating a little bit more in Syria would be that there's a lower risk for international conflict to arise. Syria isn't a huge country, as we saw from the shoot down of the Russian plane by Turkey. Russia barely drifted into Turkish airspace, and there's a lot of question to whether the Russian jet did drift into Turkish airspace or not, and Turkey shot the plane down. There's been a few close calls between U.S. and Russian planes. If the two countries are going to be operating so closely in such a small airspace with such heavily armed military planes, it made sense for the two sides to work together. At least those will reduce the risk for conflict. Other news with the U.S. foreign policy towards Russia is that the NATO buildup continues. I believe I already talked about the U.S. Forces rolling into Romania. More U.S. troops moved into Bulgaria along with some ground vehicles. And the stated purpose of this from General Mathis and other top military officials in the U.S. is to combat Russian aggression and is a build-up against Russia. Now that most of the Baltic states like Estonia, Lithuania, and Poland have all seen a significant increase in U.S. military presence. We're starting to see it around the nations of the Black Sea as well. There have even been some rumors of moving more U.S. warships into the Black Sea, once again to combat Russian aggression by putting U.S. ships on their border. This absolutely makes no sense as to why the U.S. needs to build up so much in Eastern Europe. Russia hasn't left its own borders. The only place they've operated outside of Russia, at least in the past few years, has been in Syria, and that was at the invitation of Assad. Russia has a vested interest in keeping Assad in power because Assad allows Russia to have their only military base on the Mediterranean Sea. And Assad is seen as a counterforce to ISIS and jihadism, which is an issue for Russia, as well as the U.S. Russia suffers from terrorist attacks as well. If anybody remembers the Russian plane that got blown up over the Sinai a few years back. The U.S. is also asking its NATO allies to spend more on defense. This again is bolstering to get more defense to combat Russia. Mattis said that the countries need to spend roughly 2% of their GDP on defense, or they risk curtailing of U.S. support. I think there's some advantage to this policy for U.S. citizens because the U.S. is essentially subsidizing the defense of the Eastern European and other NATO countries. The U.S. has such a massive military and spends so much money on defense that these other countries really don't have to spend money on defense because the U.S. is bound through NATO to go to war on behalf of these countries that they are invading. So these countries could really act in any way they want and not see any repercussions from it because they know that the U.S. military is backing them up. It's like maybe having a really rambunctious younger brother who's willing to pick fights and run off his mouth because he knows his big bad older brother will back him up if anybody threatens him. And so it's setting up a situation where these countries spend no money on defense but yet get to act as belligerently as they want because they know that the NATO alliance has their back at all times. I think the best solution would just be to pull out of NATO. The Soviet Union has fallen. Russia isn't looking to extend its borders. And at this point, the best situation would probably be for the U.S. just to pull out of NATO and allow these countries to provide for their own defense and look to negotiate peace treaties with Russia because without NATO, they would probably have to, come to some better agreement. There's also the issue of Trump and Crimea. I think I talked about this on the last podcast where Trump had demanded that Russia return Crimea to Ukraine, and I had explained that the people of Crimea voted to secede from Ukraine, and it really doesn't make sense that Russia would return Crimea to Ukraine since the people of Crimea don't want to be a part of Ukraine. So in addition to Trump's demands that Russia return Crimea to the Ukraine, Trump sent out a tweet, Russia took Crimea from Ukraine by force. This is simply untrue. What happened is that Crimea seceded from Ukraine, then chose to join the Russian Federation. There were a few Ukrainian military troops left in Crimea, and the Russian military, or suspected members of the Russian military at least, went into Ukraine and fired a couple bullets. Nobody got hit, nobody got killed. It was completely bloodless, and to basically chase out the military that the people of Crimea no longer wanted there. So Trump's tweet only serves to create more hostilities between the two countries and isn't factual in any way. As much as the left loves to talk about fake news, and the news media has been going on about weeks about how much Trump lies and all the Trump lies, this is one story that really hasn't gotten a whole lot of coverage exposing it as fake news. I'm guessing that a large part of the reason why this hasn't been talked about as much as far as the fake news story goes is Obama also had the policy that Russia took Crimea by force and Russia bullies the Ukrainians and stole Crimea. And so it would really reflect negatively on President Obama as well. Now we're going to move into a little bit more Syria talk. We have a situation in Syria that's brewing that we're going to keep our eyes on as we move forward, but I want to talk about a little bit now, and that's Turkey versus Syrian Kurds. Turkey is planning to move towards Raqqa after they secure al-Bab from ISIS. The Kurdish troops are already moving towards Raqqa. The Kurds are actually U.S. supported, and the plan for the Kurds to take Raqqa is part of the U.S. plan to take Raqqa from ISIS. The U.S. actually recently supplied the Kurds with some armored vehicles to help made some progress on this front. So Kurdish leaders said that they would attack Turkey if Turkey came too close to Raqqa, and planned to take Raqqa and not let Turkey be involved in that operation. So we're seeing a really impending conflict come up here. Part of the big issue will be to see where America takes sides. America is a NATO ally to Turkey, but has also supported the Kurds in their mission to retake Raqqa. And so it's going to put the U.S. in a difficult position on what side or what alliance they're going to essentially stab in the back. My guess is that they'll probably end up casting the Kurds aside and taking the side of Turkey, as the NATO alliance is stronger than the alliance they made with the Kurds. But it's also going to put the U.S. in an awkward position. It's explaining to Turkey why the Kurdish forces are using American weapons to kill their soldiers. Overall, the real beneficiaries of this issue is going to be ISIS, because ISIS is going to be able to hold on to Raqqa longer while the enemies of ISIS are fighting each other. A lot of times both sides using US-made weapons, and it's only going to serve ISIS to be able to hold out a little bit longer. I think this is probably the ISIS goal in Mosul as well, is that they're hoping that they could hold on to western Mosul so long that the Kurdish and the Shia and Sunni militias and the Iraqi army all turn on each other before they're able to finish taking the city, and then ISIS will sit back and watch people kill each other. Sticking with Syria, we have a situation in the Idlib and Homs province with rebels fighting each other. Originally, it was Al-Qaeda-backed or Al-Qaeda-linked rebels fighting with the more moderate Free Syrian Army rebels. However, at least ISIS-linked or ISIS-supported or ISIS ideological rebels is sometimes hard to tell if they're actually associated with ISIS or if they just believe in the ISIS message, started attacking the Al-Qaeda rebels. Through the fighting, there was a lot of deaths on both sides, and a lot of fighters were taken hostage. The ISIS fighters decided to execute the hostages they had taken from the other sides. It's estimated that about 200 fighters were killed in total, most of those being the less extremist Free Syrian Army fighters, but also 40 to 50, as high as 60 Al-Qaeda-backed fighters. It has also come to light that the U.S. military used depleted uranium weapons in Syria. These weapons had not been used since 2003 in the U.S.'s invasion of Iraq, and there's a lot of issues as to whether if these weapons cause cancer or birth defects. There's a lot of concerns about the populations in the area on if that will happen. It's unknown exactly where these weapons were used, but the U.S. military did say they used these weapons to take out ISIS fuel tankers. It's interesting that they used these weapons because they really didn't have to. These weapons are used to pierce tank armor, and these were, semi-trucks with oil tankers on the back, so it really wasn't necessary to use them. And they also could have used missiles, because sometimes they use missiles to take out these things as well. But once again, we're seeing a case where the U.S. is really shooting itself in the foot, because using these weapons really turns the civilian population of the countries against the United States. Like I said, many people are afraid that these weapons cause cancer or birth defects, and the civilian populations really hate that they're used in their country. So we're really risking turning the Syrian people against the U.S. or more against the U.S. than they already are. Around the Middle East, there were a few ISIS suicide bombing attacks that are making big headlines. At least 55 people were killed when ISIS set off a car bomb near car dealerships in Baghdad. This was in a suburb that's mainly populated by Shia, and as ISIS being Sunni jihadists, that's why they picked that target. It's really showing that the country of Iraq doesn't have control over what's going on there, as these terrorist attacks are happening a little bit more often. ISIS also had a suicide bombing in Pakistan that killed at least 100 people. That suicide bombing happened at a shrine targeting Shiite civilians. In response to the attacks, Pakistan closed their border with Afghanistan, believing that the suicide bombers bled through that border and came into the country in that way. Overall, seeing the spread of ISIS should be concerning and telling about how big of a failure the U.S.'s war against ISIS has been. Once again, we're seeing a situation where the harder we try to stamp out ISIS, the more ISIS we get, and it's really going all over the world. You see cases where ISIS is now aligned with Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab. It's in Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, and it's really just popping up all over the world, and it seems like the more bombs we drop on ISIS, the more they appear in other countries. The last talking point about the Middle East will be about Yemen. A funeral was bombed in Yemen by a Saudi plane, killing at least 5 women. I've seen reports that it's as high as 11. It seems that the mourners were pretty much all women or children, and like I said, a Saudi airplane dropped a bomb on that funeral. There are some reports that there was a signature strike. A signature strike is a attack on the same location 5 to 10 minutes afterwards, and it usually hits aid workers. There are some conflicting reports on whether or not that happened, but it would be interesting if the Saudi military is using that method of killing against civilian targets. Also, in Yemen, a report came out that said that one of the men killed in the botched U.S. raid in Yemen was a supporter of the Hadi government. The Hadi government is the government that Saudi Arabia is trying to restore to power, and therefore the government that the U.S. is working to support as well. And he was the most high-ranking person, or the most notable person killed in that raid. And so it's interesting to know exactly what the U.S. was trying to accomplish in that raid, because it seems like now that they only were able to kill allies and civilians in that raid. Moving to North Korea, Secretary of Defense James Mattis came out and said that the U.S. would defend South Korea and Japan from a North Korean nuclear attack using the American nuclear arsenal. This is a promise that Obama had made, and it's interesting to note that it is the continuation of the policy for the Trump administration as well. During the campaign, Trump had made it clear that the U.S. was subsidizing the defense of its allies too much, and actually mentioned South Korea by name. But it seems like the U.S. plans to continue that policy of putting its ultimate weapons on the doorstep of North Korea and saying, if you cross this line, we're going to nuke you. Once again, this is Trump making his campaign promises to reduce the military spending to protect other countries and focus more on America. Overall, it seems like the direction that the Trump foreign policy is headed is less in the Trump campaign style promises and more in the direction of Obama's foreign policy of trying to really police the entire world, trying to fight terrorism in every corner, and killing civilians in the process, wasting American money and putting American troops in harm's way. While Trump talked a lot about working with Russia, so far his administration has only worked to create barriers with Russia, continues the NATO buildup in East Europe, continues to demand the return of Crimea to Ukraine, and overall just made poor decisions. The one place where Trump's foreign policy seems to differ the most from Obama's is in Israel. Trump's change of policy from a two-state solution to a one-state solution in Israel is interesting, and hopefully will help to move some sort of peace process along in that country. And Trump's statements on the settlements also, I think, is great to hear. We typically don't hear much out of presidents, especially Republican presidents, about what wrong Israel is doing to the Palestinian people. And while this isn't a condemnation of the Israeli policy against the Palestinian people, it is a step in the right direction. Well, that's all the news I have for you today. I will be back on Monday with show number 4, but until then, you can read my news roundups on kylesfilesblog.com or at the Libertarian Institute. You can follow me on Twitter or message me on Twitter at KYAAALE. You could like my page on Facebook. I'm at facebook.com/KylesFiles. Also, if you could, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Give me a good rating and review. That'd be very helpful. Thank you all for listening. I'll talk to you again.